Welcome to this year's annual event, the U.S. Constitution Day Forum. Yesterday was actually the birthday of the Constitution, and we have a federal government obligation to provide an annual program about the U.S. Constitution. Oddly, that has been in place now for at least 10 years, and once it happened, we thought, gee, why weren't we doing this? This is a wonderful opportunity each year to talk about an amazing document and about its relevance in 2018. So very happy that you're here. Some, of course, are voluntary. Some have been volunteered to be here, but we appreciate your time with us. My name is Fred Locken. I'm today's moderator. The process here will work pretty simple. We will have a two-part program. The first part will be a series of questions that we put to the panelists, and we will allow each of them a chance to respond to it, perhaps to exchange if they wish to discuss more thoroughly or debate something. And we will do that for about an hour, and then we will have a solid 15 minutes set aside for questions from you. To allow the question period to move on, we've put index cards at the table where you came in, asking that if you'd like to ask a question, that you grab one of those index cards. Actually, you could also just use a sheet of paper if you have it, and just write out your question in a way that size me up. I can read, okay? I got to be able to read it. And if you could use your first name just so we can give you attribution. And then Mark, our president of the History Club, will be available to collect them, and he will bring them up to me at that magical moment. So we do want you to have questions. You may not think about a question until you're hearing the dialogue. We respect that, so know that we can do that. But instead of calling on you and trying to get a mic to you and all of that sort of thing, we're going to try the question card process and see how that works. Beyond that, we do want to indicate that this is being recorded, and so it will be posted at TMCC for anyone that just found it so fascinating you wanted to share it with someone else. It could happen. Give it a chance. Come on, it could happen. And also will be very useful for all of our classes going forward. But we've had the opportunity with our fantastic videographer on campus to record a number of these, and it's rather interesting to go back and see the issues that we have discussed throughout the many years now of this program. We have three wonderful panelists here today to talk about a very specific aspect of the Constitution, impeachment in the United States Constitution. This is a very interesting topic that has been a very interesting topic since the inception. We will look at its historical context and then its contemporary applications. But the three experts that we have this morning, beginning with Dr. Precious Hall, Professor of Political Science here at TMCC. And you're going to be really impressed right now. To her left is Dr. Brian Fletcher, also a Professor of Political Science at TMCC. And to his left, because I'm on a roll, is Dr. John Reed, Professor of History at TMCC. And he is by and far the best, most outstanding scholar of the group. He made me say that. So, opposite. Gotta get them kind of fired up, right?
Opposite.
We have, oh, don't be an apologist. We're going to, okay. So we're going to get to the questions, and we're going to start with a historical question, and we're going to direct it to our historian. So this seems to be easiest. You're my closest there, John.
Sure.
So how was impeachment handled at the Constitutional Convention, and what was the framers' intent in including it?
Thanks, Fred, and welcome, everybody. Thank you all for coming out, and I just wanted to say, we have to do this, but that's not why we do it. We do it because we love it. That's right. Right. We do this panel because we love the Constitution, and it's not because it's a requirement. Before I get into the history a little bit, I just want to say I don't think we should be servants to the history ever. So we can look to this history for guidance or wisdom, but I think it would be a real mistake in any case if you find some kind of historical intent of the framers and then feel like we must be bound by that in the present. The world has changed greatly. We should change with it, in my opinion. Nonetheless, I think it can give us some wisdom. So I thought I would just start out with a couple of lesser-known aspects about the convention itself that really help us, I think, to understand this impeachment in particular. and really show how difficult it is to find a framer's intent on impeachment. There really is, I would argue to you, no one framer's intent. If you're looking for it, you're going to have a great difficulty finding it. And let me tell you why I think that. If we look at the operation of the convention, we need to, it's not well known, I think, some aspects of it. It's only 3.5 months long, for one thing, that's well known. But it's conducted in secret. So we don't have a detailed notes about what happened in that convention. We do have Madison's notes and a few other notes that are really our window into it, but they're fragmented. And this has actually turned out, I think, to be a good thing because it allowed for compromise in that room that would not have happened if it had been public. An even lesser known fact, but I think very important, is the way the convention operated. They operated as a committee of the whole, and that's kind of a complicated thing, but what it means is that they took frequent votes, but they weren't binding. They were like what we would call straw polls. So a issue would come up for a vote, several times would pass, and then could be readdressed 2 weeks later and be discussed all over again, which would have driven me insane. I would have had to leave because I wouldn't be able to take that. But that allowed for issues and ideas to evolve over time. So that complicates our intent, though, because, for example, not involving impeachment, but on July 26th, there was a vote about the nature of the presidency, and it passed 7-3. That presidency was a one-term president, no re-election, and a 7-year term. So that just goes to show you that this was an evolving process, a little bit like making sausage. So what was the intent of the founders regarding the presidency? Well, at which founder, at what time? That said, let's look briefly at the comments that were made about impeachment. That's our topic today. And I think you'll see that they're a little bit all over the map. And of course, my colleagues can expand and go into detail on this. But the first mention I see is June 2nd, where Dickinson says that he believes impeachment should be when the legislature or Congress has no confidence, essentially the parliamentary method. That is abandoned without further discussion. On June 18th, Alexander Hamilton comes in and makes a very long-winded speech in which he advocates for a particular type of government. Interestingly, he advocates for a lifetime president and a lifetime Senate. And he says that should be, the impeachment should be for mal, M-A-L, meaning presumably bad, or corrupt conduct. That's abandoned without further discussion. On July 26, James Madison suggests incapacity, negligence, or perfidy, meaning disloyalness, probably like treason. And Governor Morris suggests bribery, treachery, corrupting his electors, and incapacity. They abandoned that without making a decision. The Committee of Detail at the end of August, that's a small group that breaks off and shapes the Constitution without the others, for the first time brings back, they absorb all that and they say, well, how about treason and bribery? And that's where we first see that. Then finally, on September 8th, about a week before they dismiss and sign the document, there is a final debate about impeachment. They still have not decided it. And Elbridge Gerry and George Mason suggest maladministration be added to bribery and treason. James Madison objects, according to the notes, and he says that's too narrow. That would make the president at the service of the Senate. In other words, he would be dependent on the Senate. So Mason then suggests high crimes and misdemeanors. It's not discussed. It passes 8-3, and that's what we are living with today. So even if we take the final document and you say, what was the intent? Well, 3 voted against the final document, saying treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors. So the intent is going to be difficult for us to find, but I think we can see some general principles there.
Dr. Hall?
Yes, I would just add that I think that in general, when we talk about the intent of impeachment, it really is to get to the point that no man or no one person in the government was to be above the law. I think there were disagreements on exactly what that should look like, hence the debates between treason, bribery, other high crimes, misdemeanors, and the vagueness of those terms, but the overall intent really was to serve as a check on the executive. We wanted to understand that this was one person that would have a lot of power and authority, and this one person should not have ultimate power and authority. So regardless of the specifics of impeachment, the overall intent, I think we would all agree, of the framers was to ensure that no one person, i.e. for us, the president, would be above the law in the United States.
And Dr. Fletcher.
Yes, I agree with my two esteemed colleagues. Just to build a little bit on what Dr. Hall said, Elbridge Gerry said that a good magistrate will not fear impeachment, but a bad one ought to be kept in fear of them. And so there was a general consensus that if you're going to have an executive branch, you need to have a mechanism to keep that executive branch accountable. And impeachment is that mechanism. I'd add two other things. I think Dr. Reed's absolutely right. It's really hard to divine the intent of the framers all the time. And part of the reason why, with respect to impeachment, it's hard to divine the intent is because, to be frank, they spent most of the Constitutional Convention focused on Congress. Article 2 isn't an afterthought. I mean, they definitely wanted to create a presidential system of government, but they didn't put nearly as much time into it. And there are a couple ways you can sort of illustrate this. One is succession for the presidency. It's a mess, right? You have to have several additional amendments to figure out how we should elect a president, what should happen if the president dies, and we've eventually got to the point now where that's a little bit clearer than it used to be. And the same thing's true with impeachment. John's absolutely right. At the very end, they toss in this phrase, which we're going to spend much of the day talking about, high crimes and misdemeanors, but they don't define it, and that leaves us with some difficulty. The last thing that I'd like to say is that even though it is difficult to determine their specific analysis of what a high crime and misdemeanor might be, and we'll get into more of that a little bit later, they knew that impeachment was going to be a political process. And the easiest way to understand that is to look at what Hamilton had to say about it in Federalist 65. He said, look, impeachments might be decided on the strength of parties, not the guilt or innocence of the accused. And so even though we don't know exactly what perhaps they meant by the specific procedures of impeachment, we do know that they knew it was going to be political. And one of the themes I imagine that's going to emerge out of today's discussion is that impeachments are very political.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that, Brian mentioned Hamilton Federalist 65. You can all look this up with me if you want, although Hamilton's writing is not something I would recommend unless you are looking for a quick way to fall asleep. I know we celebrate him, but there's a reason that they turned it into rap instead of using his actual words, because he is boring as hell. But this is being filmed. I probably shouldn't say that. He's wonderful. We love him.
He's brilliant.
He's brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, I reread Federalist 65 a couple of days ago, and I was
I'm
like,
sorry to hear that.
Oh yeah, well, it was a pain, but I was like, gosh, he really understood what was going to happen.
Yeah. He's generally noted as the most intellectually gifted of the framers. There's
Exactly.
really no doubt about that. I just was making a joke at his expense. I find
Yeah,
his
no,
writing
he deserves that too.
very
Yeah, it's
difficult to
awful.
get through. Anyway, since Brian mentioned it, I have it right here, the phrase he's talking about. And he says, the jurisdiction of impeachment would cover, quote, offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. They are of a nature which may with peculiar propriety be denominated political in all caps, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to society itself. So that's one of the clearest statements we have about what at least Hamilton thought impeachment should be about.
Of course, other than a fantastic musical, Hamilton is also our historical figure who is killed in a duel with Aaron Burr. Many had anticipated that Hamilton would be a president. Was well on his track of credibility to become one. And that is one of those interesting moments in American history that prompted an amendment to the Constitution and perhaps changed the direction and trajectory of the United States. We'll never know. Well, that was a fascinating response. And so we are left with the feeling that high crimes and misdemeanors is rather undefined at this point in time. I want to make sure you walk out of the room today empowered. And so if you thought, well, okay, I'm going to get all of the answers, of course, are not always as clear as you want them to be. That said, what then were the first tests of impeachment in our political process, and were there any precedents that would help us better understand the circumstances of impeachment?
I think as far as the test for impeachment, it's clear to understand that impeachment does not just apply to the president. Federal judges can be impeached as well. So really what we'll see is that historically, we've actually never had a president removed from office due to impeachment, but we've had several federal judges who have been removed from office for things that mainly fall under high crimes and misdemeanors, things such as tax evasion, things such as accepting bribes for court decisions. So really when we talk about precedent being set, we have to understand that the precedent is really coming from the federal judges, because we've only had 2 presidents who've ever had impeachment proceedings formally started against them, and none of them were ever removed. And to be clear, to try to help guard against the politicalness of it, impeachment is very much a 2-step process. So it's not as if somebody can wake up today and say, oh, the president ought to be impeached or this judge ought to be impeached. It's can be somewhat a lengthy process and somewhat a difficult process to actually have accomplished. But the precedence for impeachment really lies with federal judges, and most of those are for those other crimes and misdemeanors. We don't have many people who have been impeached for treason or things like that. And usually it's what we call abuse of power. You are in a position and you misuse that position to have personal gain.
I would agree. That's certainly true. A general statement of it. I would add that it's been remarkably rare. What anniversary of the Constitution are we on right now? This is 13 plus 18, 221. Let's get our calculators out. Let's just say over 200 years. I know better than that. Over 200 years, and by my count, there have been 15 impeachments of federal judges. I'm not sure that's exactly correct, but I think that's pretty close. And of those, my count is 7 have been removed. So no presidents, and again, I'm not sure those numbers are exactly right, but they're pretty close. They may not be right up to date, but it's remarkably rare. One thing to think about too, and I hate to drag us back into the Middle Ages, but high crimes and misdemeanors was not created out of thin air, right? It actually comes from the English system, and its first use is in the 1300s. And the English did use they called it an impeachment process, with impeachment in the House of Commons and trial in the House of Lords, the higher house, to get rid of officials who were engaged in misconduct. And so if you look back, and again, I don't know if that history is relevant to how we want to use it, but how they used it, their common uses were misapplication of funds, abuse of power, neglect of duty, corruption, betrayal of trust, and giving pernicious advice to the crown. So when Mason came up with high crimes and misdemeanors, he's borrowing a phrase from the past that had some specific meaning, but mostly, as Precious said, it was abuse of their office in some way. And if we go to the Chase case, I think, if you said early precedents, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think one way to look at this too would be to look at how the nation handled the first impeachments, because that could give us a clue as to what they were thinking about it. And so we have the first 2 federal judges in 1803, so fairly soon. And the first one is Pickering. I think his first name is John Pickering. Mm-hmm. And he is removed, and there doesn't seem to be any debate that this was a good idea. Generally for drunkenness on the bench was one of the main charges against him, and other activities that were unbecoming of a judge.
I thought he was losing his mind.
Yes.
It's also been said he's losing his mind. Yeah, mental incapacity may have been part of it too, or maybe the alcohol was causing the mental incapacity, I'm not sure. But and that was really little debate on that one, and since there's been little debate on that one. But that's kind of interesting because none of those are crimes, right? So some people would say today, well, it has to be a crime, an indictable crime to be impeached. Well, the very first one, it was not a crime. It was just he was not capable. It was an incapacity, really. The Chase case, 1803, the Supreme Court justice, is even more interesting though, because Chase is impeached because he is a vehement Federalist. And he is a Supreme Court judge when the Republicans have come into power, the Jeffersonian Republicans. And they are angry about the treatment they received under the Federalists. But Chase is unrepentant. And from the bench, he is partisan. He makes anti-Republican statements from the bench. He seems to openly mistreat lawyers from the other side or plaintiffs from the other side. And so he's impeached. And it comes down to the Senate, and the Senate refuses to convict him. So they set a precedent that partisan behavior is not going to be impeachable. And one of the reasons they did that, because they realized if they did that, then the other side would do the same to them as soon as they could. So it would have just been a warfare of just impeaching the opposite side. So actually very wise, I think. But that does set a precedent for partisanship, partisan statements. Disagreeing with the person politically is an early precedent not to impeach.
Just to build a little on that, some legal scholars also argue it created another precedent. So Chase wasn't removed, but he understood you're not supposed to be a political activist from the bench. And some people argue that judges have learned from that. I just add two other quick things. We've talked a little bit about how it's hard to determine the framers' intent. One of the difficulties with trying to figure out what is and what is not impeachable is that impeachments, even though they have a legal component, they're not the same thing as a Supreme Court decision. So a lot of you perhaps are taking Political Science 101, and you're going to learn that when Supreme Court decisions are made, the majority writes an opinion that we can actually read and figure out exactly why the majority determined the case the way that it was determined. That's not the way impeachments work. So, for example, Andrew Johnson is the first president to be impeached. We don't know exactly why some of the senators voted the way they did not to impeach him. Some people argue that it had to do with the fact that he cut a deal promising to be a little bit better in the future. Others argue that Johnson's skin was saved only because some people were afraid that the president pro temp was too radical. And if he took over, then the situation would be even worse. These are not legal standards. That said, the House Judiciary Committee in 1974 actually tried to figure out what is and what is not impeachable. And basically they came up with three sort of categories of what is and what is not impeachable. One thing is something that Dr. Hall talked about, abuse of power. And so, for example, Clinton, Nixon, Johnson, they were all accused of this. The second category of things they thought were potentially impeachable is behavior not compatible with the functioning of the office. That's what happens with Pickering, right? He's intoxicated. It's not compatible with the behavior of the office. There's actually a couple of House impeachment resolutions right now basically accusing President Trump of the exact same thing, behavior incompatible with the office. The last sort of category is misusing the office for personal gain. And that's something that both of my colleagues have talked a little bit about, but basically engaging in corrupt practices, trading the office for perhaps some sort of monetary or personal benefit.
And Dr. Fletcher picked up on something that's very important, is that in the political process of impeachment is just the first step. It's a political process that we have to think of what's next. And the reality is sometimes what's next is not always better than who's there now. So, for example, if you impeach a president and the vice president takes over, is that person going to be any measurably better than the current president in office? So that is the politicalness of the process, because it's not just a matter of getting somebody out of office, but it's the consideration of who takes this position, who's going to be next. And if that person isn't measurably better, sometimes the political decision is made not to go through with impeachment, because it is a choice in a political process, not a legal process. Members of Congress are not these famed legal scholars that members of the Supreme Court are known to be. These are people from various walks of life, various levels of education, degree attainment, etc. So who knows why they decide to do something? But what we do know is that the consideration always at the end of that is who's next? And is this worth the step for who would potentially take over? And sometimes the answer is no, it's not worth it.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the Johnson case, well, I'm not sure it's that interesting, but one of the interesting things is he didn't pick a vice president. He's never elected. He assumes office after Lincoln is assassinated. but doesn't right away pick a vice president, which we've since learned it needs to be done for just this very reason. So yeah, if he had been impeached, it would have gone to the president pro tem of the Senate, who was, I think it was Wade, right, who was a radical Republican, and one of the radical Republicans too. So that was kind of an unusual political calculation. But also, Johnson is a bit of an anomaly too. It's 1868, right? The election is coming up then too. So even if you impeach him, you got to stick with him a few more months. And he didn't even get the nomination for the Democratic Party at that time. So yeah, the political calculations there are distinctly different than they would be today, I think.
Sure.
Yeah.
You've been using some terminology, and I know that for those of us who teach the U.S. and Nevada Constitutions, there's often some initial confusion. So if we could clarify what it means to impeach, and possibly just one of you explain the process, what has to happen in the House, what has to happen in the Senate.
You want to do that?
Sure, why not? Okay, so impeachment per the Constitution is a two-step process. It first must begin in the House of Representatives, where they have to file what's called articles of impeachment, where they literally put on paper, we believe that this person should be impeached for abuse of power, lack of bringing integrity to the office, whatever it is that they are accusing this person of doing or believe that this person has done wrong. That's a necessary first step. So the reason why that's important is because we have to understand that even if the Senate wanted to impeach a particular person in a particular office, we don't do things in reverse. We can't start with the Senate, then go to the House. This very much has to be the House of Representatives. And the reasoning behind it starting with the House of Representatives is because the House of Representatives is really considered the people's house. Remember that when the Constitution was written in 1787, it was only the members of the House who were elected. Members of the Senate were appointed. So the framers thought that with this impeachment process starting, it was important that it came from elected representatives rather than those who are appointed. So without the House of Representatives, impeachment first and foremost cannot happen. Once the House files what we call articles of impeachment, they then have to take a vote. And they have to vote whether or not this official ought to be impeached through these articles. That's only the first step. But impeachment in the House does not equal automatic removal from office. Once an official is impeached in the House, we then have to go to the second layer of the process, which is with the United States Senate for literally a trial, an impeachment trial. And again, this is a political, not a legal process. So for example, somebody who's technically found guilty during a Senate trial doesn't mean that they're going to be put out of office and go straight to jail. That's not what that means. It means that they're found guilty of the charges in the articles of impeachment and would have to then leave office. So with the impeachment trial, just like any other trial, you have the judge who's usually the chief of the Supreme Court who presides over this trial. Witnesses are called in for both sides to determine whether or not this person did violate high crimes, misdemeanors, etc., is charged by the House, or if they didn't. At the end of that trial, it takes a vote. And you need a majority of the senators to say yes, that this person has done what the House has accused them to do in order for them to actually leave office. You have to get through all of that before someone actually leaves. So when we talk about presidential impeachments, we've had two presidents formally impeached by the House. One, Nixon, who was going to be impeached by the House, but resigned before he actually did. When we talk about federal judges, it's not uncommon that you've had judges who have had articles of impeachment filed against them, and they have resigned before it's even gone to trial because they know let's just give it up. It's fine, we'll let it go. So the reality is that two-step process takes some time, and it also gives that person who's being accused of violating their terms of office to think and to consider if this is something they want to go through with, if this is something they would rather resign over, or if they're going to fight to clear their name and their reputation. But it is a two-step process that must start in the House of Representatives.
And what does it mean to impeach?
Are you
To any of you.
basically, it's being charged with a crime.
Charged, yeah.
So if you're looking for an analogy to the domestic legal system, it's being charged with a crime. And then when the impeachment process actually happens, after the impeachment actually happens, the House actually acts as the prosecuting attorneys in the Senate. So it's the equivalent of being charged with a crime.
One thing, too, to emphasize is the high bar in the Senate
Yes.
for conviction, a two-thirds.
Supermajority.
Supermajority. So if it had been a simple majority, Johnson would have been convicted, and he was impeached. He would have been convicted and kicked out of office. He survived by one vote of a supermajority. So that, especially in our partisan times, and especially if we're thinking about what may happen next year or the year after, that is an almost impossibly high bar. And in Johnson's case, he was facing an overwhelming majority of the opposite party. I think it was 25-7 or something remarkable like that. And even they couldn't. They decided not to get rid of him as well. So if I were advising the Democrats, and they haven't asked, and they shouldn't take my advice.
After today, they will.
Well, this will go viral for sure.
Yeah.
I would advise them that unless whatever is found is so egregious that they can get votes of Republicans in the Senate, verbal commitments to them before they even start, I would recommend they don't even pursue it, because it's almost impossible to do with a high bar.
And to be clear, there's no real consequence of being impeached in the House. Real in the sense that, yes, it'll be noted, it'll go on your file, you'll get a slap on the wrist, bad, tisk, tisk. But unless you are impeached and convicted in the Senate, life goes on the next day. They take a vote. If it fails, you still get to continue being in your office. Nothing essentially happens. It goes in history that you were impeached, but as far as actual material ramifications from being impeached in the House versus the Senate, there's no real measurable impact.
And to this process, having identified the impeachment process in the Constitution, other than impeachment, are there any other checks and balances available to the legislature or judiciary to control what they might see as abuses of the presidency or judge?
Do you want me to handle it? Sure. Well, obviously there's congressional oversight, so that usually involves hearings. There are a couple of other things that you can point to as an example of holding the executive in check. One is the 25th Amendment. This has gotten a lot of discussion in the last couple of months. Basically, the 25th Amendment is when the vice president and a majority of the cabinet basically vote and say that the president is not capable of doing the job. If that happens, the president gets the opportunity to say, no, in fact, I am capable of doing the job. And then you have another vote by the vice president and the cabinet. And if that second vote finds the exact same thing, then you have a vote in Congress. And there you actually need 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. So it's actually even a higher bar than impeachment. The 25th Amendment was largely constructed because there's been some concerns about what might happen if a president became very ill and was unable to carry out the job, either mentally ill or physically ill. So there are some historians, for example, who argue that this basically happened with Woodrow Wilson,
Yes, yeah.
Perhaps a little bit with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In fact, I can't remember, the chief of staff for Reagan actually was a little nervous about this and did his own sort of acuity test to determine whether Reagan was fully functional. And so that's one check. Another check that's actually not in the Constitution but actually has been used against the president is something called censure. And censure is basically a public reprimand. So we've actually only had one president who got like a full censure. There have been a couple who've been accused of censure-like resolutions, but only Andrew Jackson got a full censure, and this happened in the 1830s over the National Bank. Interestingly enough, after the public reprimand, there was an election. A lot more of his allies won, and his allies in the Senate went ahead and removed the censure. And so those are a couple of the checks that you can find. With respect to censure, it isn't actually clear whether or not that's constitutional or not. So it's not in the Constitution. So for example, when Bill Clinton faced impeachment, a lot of House Republicans were asked, why don't you censure him instead of impeaching him? And they said, look, we can't censure him. It's not in the Constitution. A couple of Senate Democrats actually said, yeah, we should censure him. He deserves a public reprimand. And after the impeachment failed, they actually tried to do that and were unsuccessful.
And let's keep in mind that the route of the vice president going through the cabinet is picked by the president. So the president tries not to pick people who will then turn around and say that he's unfit for office. Even with our current president and presidents in past, anytime there is dissension in the cabinet, they kindly ask for resignations to ensure that their circle around them would not be these same people who would then also turn around and stage ultimately what some might call a coup against the president. So for those of you who are thinking that's a way out of this situation, not really,
Not gonna happen.
no.
Thank you for that. You've identified that Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton are the two presidents in American history that have gone to trial in the United States Senate. What would you find to be the similarities and differences in those two instances of the impeachment process?
Off the bat, I would say that one was about constitutional duty and the other was about the law in and of itself. Bill Clinton's was about perjury, which is lying under oath, which is a crime. But Andrew Johnson's, when I say constitutional duties, it is the job of the president to uphold the laws of the country. And what he was impeached for was his refusal to enact a law that had been passed by Congress. So the major difference there is that we had two presidents impeached, one for lack of upholding his constitutional duties, the other for not necessarily abuse of power, but literally violating a law, which was perjury. So I would say that's definitely a major difference.
Yeah, a similarity would be between Clinton and Johnson is that they were presidents who both were facing very hostile Congresses. I think that's
Yeah.
fair to say. So definitely with Johnson, he was the accidental president. He was the Democrat amongst a sea of Republicans, and so there was open hostility towards him, and it was mutual. And I think that was true with President Clinton as well, especially after '94 when Republicans took the House.
Yes.
And I don't remember if they took the Senate then as well or not, but they definitely retook the House, and that really shifted to a really negative relationship between Clinton and the Congress. So that I would say that's a similarity. But I agree with Dr. Hall that they are very different in terms of the charges.
Yeah. Is another similarity. Many people feel that for both Johnson and Clinton, their impeachments weren't over the actual articles of impeachment themselves.
Right.
So for Johnson, yes, he was impeached for not implementing, was it the Tenure of Office Act that was passed by Congress, but many people feel it was just because he was such a horrible president and not helping with Reconstruction after the Civil War. So many people feel that that was the means to impeach him for his behavior after the Civil War. And for Clinton, many people felt because of his hostile relationship with Congress that it really wasn't about the perjury. It was a means to get him out of office in a political manner that otherwise couldn't be done. So that would be a similarity between the two, that impeachment was used definitely politically to get to two people, not for what they were actually charged with, but for their behaviors before.
As Alexander Hamilton sort of predicted, right? I think most people view those impeachments as at least partially political. And I think Dr. Reed's exactly right. The animus towards President Clinton in the House was palpable. There were lots of House Republicans who thought that he brought dishonor to the White House. And so they wanted to have the impeachment. There was also a lot of animus towards Johnson. He was the mistake of president,
Yes.
really. And so that is something. I would say, though, there's one little bit of a difference that was true, especially in the Johnson case. And you could probably speak more about this. I mean, part of the Johnson case, though, was a battle between how powerful the executive is going to be versus how powerful the Congress is going to be. So for those of you who don't know much about Andrew Johnson, as Dr. Hall talked a little bit about, the Congress passed an act which basically said that if you're going to fire a cabinet member, you have to get the Senate's approval. Actually, I think the act was a little bit broader. It said you have to ask the Senate's approval for any firing of anyone who's been confirmed by the Senate.
Yeah,
correct?
and I think you also had to wait for the next replacement to be confirmed.
You had to name the replacement as well.
Yeah.
And so,
which is clearly unconstitutional.
Sure, in retrospect, the Supreme Court has
retrospect,
said that. But you had a battle of basically branch power. Is the Congress going to be able to constrict the president's hiring and firing choices, or just the hiring choices? And Johnson put that battle to the test.
Yeah, and also it was a battle about who decides what's constitutional. because Johnson decided to put himself as the arbiter instead of going to the Supreme Court, which would be the way you would do it. He says, no, I know this is not constitutional. I'm deciding that, so I'm not going to follow it.
Sure.
And it was the Tenure of Office Act. It was an impeachment trap, as they say. It was designed to get. They knew he would disobey it, so
Sure.
they were trapping him into it. But he was really an awful president. I mean, in retrospect, no doubt about it. He was refusing to do what the executive is supposed to do, which is if the Congress passes a law. And if the veto is overridden, which it was time and time again, that means he has to execute it, whether he agrees with it or not. And he simply refused. He replaced all the military governors, I think, in the South, and was engaging in an extraordinarily lenient policy towards the Southern rebels. That is shocking to modern eyes.
And it's had awful ramifications, right? I mean,
Oh,
he
absolutely.
basically
Yeah.
cut the knees out under Reconstruction,
Yeah.
and that had long-term implications. He was a bad president.
He certainly was.
So, and to be honest, I didn't even realize how bad of a president he was until I read Ron Chernow's
Oh.
Grant. It's for those of you,
Yeah.
Alexander Hamilton's an awful read, but there's a new biography of Grant that's a brilliant read. I encourage you to read it, and it just describes that he was basically racist, that he's responsible for a lot of the long-term racial problems that we've had in the South, and so irrespective of the constitutional battle, he deserved not to be president.
Yeah.
The
Yes,
question is could you remove him?
He firmly earned,
constitutionally?
he
Yes.
firmly earned the
Yeah.
approbation. Yeah, and he was. I mean, I'm not sure this is relevant, but he was not like the reason Lincoln chose him is because it was a unification ticket. So you would never see that today.
No.
It's like I'm going to reach across the aisle and have a vice president of the other party. And one of the reasons was we tend to forget this, but Lincoln and the Republicans were really focused on keeping the border states in. The border states didn't secede. And so they had to make all kinds of conciliation to keep them from seceding. They felt this was very important. And so bringing Johnson in from a state that did secede, Tennessee, was kind of a way to assuage them, not realizing, of course, what would happen. But that's very unusual. It would be like if President Trump had, I don't know, I don't want to go down this road, but if he picked Al Gore as his vice president or something. I mean, that's a whole very different situation altogether. But he was not a very broad thinker. He never had any formal education. He was a tailor by trade. I think he didn't learn to write until he was in his teens or some say early 20s. And he was very stubborn. He would never change his mind. So he just was not a very, that's terrible characteristics for an executive generally. And I think, we've had some executives since then that have exhibited similar characteristics. And it's never been good.
Now, you mentioned previously that Richard Nixon was someone that was also engaged in the start of the process, but it never even reached a point of the House taking formal action. Why do you think we talk so much about the president and that period of American history if it never even made it through the full House to be a formal charge?
Well, I have to confess, every single semester when I teach political science 1, I ask my students what I call a Jeopardy question. Name the 2 presidents who've been impeached. And every student, not every student, but 90% of students think that Nixon was impeached. Nixon was not actually impeached. Nixon was going to be impeached. The House Judiciary Committee had issued 3 articles of impeachment. They'd passed fairly overwhelmingly. The Democrats held the House. They were going to pass those articles of impeachment. Now, it's not entirely positive that he was going to lose the Senate vote, but it looks like he had a fairly good chance of losing the Senate vote. And what ended up happening is 3 very influential Republicans went to the White House and said, look, you don't have the votes in the House. You probably don't have the votes in the Senate. You need to make a decision. They said that they never asked him to resign, but they made it clear to him that he was probably going to lose, and as a result, he chose to resign. And so one reason we often talk about Nixon is because he probably would have not only been impeached but removed from office. To give you an idea of how interesting the discussion between those leaders from the Congress and Nixon was, the House Minority Leader, who was the leader of the Republicans in the House, the Senate Minority Leader, who was the leader of the Senate Republicans. And Barry Goldwater, who actually had run for president, went to the White House and gave Nixon the facts. To give you sort of modern parallels, that would be as if Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, and maybe Mitt Romney went to the White House.
Oh, yeah.
And said, look, we think you need to resign. So we've sort of touched a little bit on whether or not you're likely to have an impeachment of President Trump. I right now don't see any way that any one of those three would think about doing that, far less all three of them. And so that's the reason we often talk about Nixon.
And the thing with, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No,
you can
go
say,
right ahead.
one thing too with Nixon is that the crimes were so obvious
Egregious.
and on tape.
It's just egregious.
So I mean that's the other thing with Clinton, that there's no tape. With Johnson, there's no tape. I mean, with Nixon, once you hear the tapes and they found out what was really going on, it's even shocking to this day. And one of the articles is that, and to me one of the most egregious is him using the agencies of the federal government to attack his political opponents. He authorizes a crime. He authorizes a break-in. It's shocking stuff.
Yeah, and because what he did was so egregious, it would have been difficult for the Senate to justify not impeaching Nixon. And if you're Richard Nixon and you have one of two choices, either resign being president of the United States or go down in history as the first president ever to be removed from office due to impeachment, your best bet is to resign. And that's what he did. He resigned, and we know he was guilty. He did some things, but as far as the record goes, he was never impeached. And that's the better record to have in history than to go down being the first president ever removed from office due to impeachment.
To that end, you've mentioned our current president, Donald Trump. And there have been, it's only a 2-year presidency, but truly in the media and within some circles of Washington, D.C., that the topic of impeachment has come up. Would you be able to discuss, what has been discussed so far? I mean, why has this issue come up? Are there, again, other things that are better solutions for our government than talking about impeachment at this time? Whatever you want to do with that.
So I guess I'll talk a little bit about what has happened thus far, and then also what may happen, and I'll leave the other question to you all, but I'll jump in depending on what you say. So there actually have been a couple of resolutions authorizing impeachment of President Trump in the House. So there are 4 that I know of. 2 have actually gotten a vote, although not a vote on whether or not President Trump should be impeached, but a vote on whether or not the resolution should be considered. And it's hard to say exactly whether or not that is the same thing as a vote to impeach President Trump, but we'll just go ahead and say for now that it is. Those 2 resolutions have gotten 58 and 66 votes. So in order to have actual articles of impeachment pass the House, you need 218. So you can see right away, you're a long ways from having enough people in the House to impeach President Trump. There are 2 other resolutions which haven't even been considered yet, and there's no indication that they're going to be considered. What I can tell you is that Democratic leadership has said repeatedly that any impeachment of President Trump has to be bipartisan. And what they mean by that is it will not be an impeachment where just Democrats vote to impeach President Trump. You'll have to have a significant percentage of Republicans who agree to do that. They've said that in the status quo, and they've also said that that would be true if Democrats were to win the House in November. And so what that means is that you would have to have a considerable number of Republicans join up. And I just don't see a whole lot of evidence that that's going to be the case right now. So, for example, with Nixon, one of the difficulties that he faced is that his approval ratings amongst Republicans were basically bouncing up and down between 48 and 53%. Incredibly low number. Nationally, his approval ratings were below 30%. He was a very unpopular president, in large part because, as my 2 colleagues have pointed out, the crimes were awful. In the case of President Trump, his approval ratings amongst Republicans Republicans have largely been between 80 and 90%, sometimes actually past 90%. I just don't see anything right now in the status quo that suggests that those approval ratings are going to suddenly drop off. Now, obviously, there is a bit of an elephant in the room. There is a special counsel. For those of you who don't know, his name's Robert Mueller. He is putting together perhaps a report, perhaps additional indictments. We honestly don't know. There is a possibility that as a result of his investigations, that you'll have a signed contract, say, for example, between President Trump and Vladimir Putin to engage in corruption with respect to the 2016 elections, but I doubt that's going to be the case. We have, I think, a fairly good sense of what the potential charges or potential difficulties that President Trump might face. And even with that, you've seen very little hemorrhaging amongst Republicans in terms of their support for President Trump. So I'm just guessing that given what we know now, it's very unlikely that you'll have an impeachment next year.
And the one thing to consider when it comes to possible impeachment of Donald Trump is that if it is over the Russia investigation, we have never impeached a president for something he did before he became president. That would be a precedent that would be set. Usually when we consider impeachment, it is what has been done since that person has been in office. We have never said you did something before you took office. Yes, it's in regards to those particular elections, but we've never had a situation in which we've impeached someone for something that they've done before they actually took office. So there are a lot of firsts that would have to happen in order for impeachment of Donald Trump to happen. But then this goes back to the question. For those who are in favor of Donald Trump being impeached, who is Mike Pence? And are you in favor of Mike Pence being president of the United States? Those are all equal questions that deserve equal weight and equal attention.
One thing I would add to this, too, and I'm not sure this is insightful at all, but one thing that's a little different is the temperament of President Trump. And it reminds me a little bit of the temperament of Andrew Johnson, because they're both very combative. And so I think most presidents might, if, say, for example, the Democrats win the House, which seems likely, would maybe rein in their behavior a little bit in order to not test a possible impeachment. Whereas I think President Trump's temperament is just the opposite. I mean, he tends to want to be combative and to fight. And Andrew Johnson was the same way. He was a very good speaker, and he went out on the road and he just inflamed everything by going after and purposefully poking Congress. And that seems to me that's a possibility that might change the dynamic a little bit.
Only though, I think if Republicans were to agree to that.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah. So I think that you will see an increased support amongst Democrats for impeachment, whether or not they win the House. So as I mentioned, about 66 people right now. I would guess you have a fairly good chance to actually get into the low 100s. But the House leadership is not going to have vote after vote on impeachment unless you can actually get Republicans on board. Dr. Hall talked a little bit about the fact that we've not had a president impeached for actions before becoming a president. And in fact, Nixon actually did face an article of impeachment related to tax evasion. And the House Judiciary Committee said no, that was before he became president. So even though they did think he cheated on his taxes, they didn't think it warranted impeachment. That said, and John, you might know a little bit more about this than I do. If I recall correctly, one of the concerns that the founders had when thinking about impeachment is they were worried that the Electoral College might be bought off. And so I do think that may prove to be an exception to that rule of not impeaching someone before for acts they engaged in before they became president. If the act helped you become president, then I think we might be talking about something slightly different. I don't know that.
That's interesting. Yeah, one of the quotes I read was corrupting, I can't remember which one, but corrupting the electors was one of the original.
Electoral College,
But the Electoral College works so much differently now than it does. I mean,
Sure.
you can't. It'd be very difficult to corrupt an elector now, for example, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Maybe not. Okay.
But perhaps generally in a Russian-influenced election, depending upon what would be discovered and what role. I think getting to the issue of influencing the election.
Yeah, so there have actually been a couple of Senate Republicans who've actually said outright collusion would be an impeachable offense. In fact, I think Lindsey Graham has actually said that as well. So I suggested earlier a signed contract might be what you would need. I don't think that's going to be the case,
No, I
right?
don't.
And so, but if you could, without a shadow of a doubt, demonstrate collusion, I think that there would be some Senate Republicans who would say, yeah, that's a bridge too far.
Which goes again to the allegations would have to be so egregious that it would have to be the Senate to justify why they wouldn't impeach
Sure.
at this point. And whether or not that's going to happen, we don't know, probably not, but that's essentially the road that we're on. It would have to be so egregious that the Senate would have to be able to then justify why they're not doing it as opposed to why they are.
Do any of you sense that the emollient clause is relevant in a discussion of the Trump presidency? And if so, why? If not, why not?
Maybe we
And you
should
might explain the
what
emollient clause.
is.
Yeah.
I had to look it up in 2006. I've never even noticed it in the Constitution before. I'm a little embarrassed to say. It's never come up in my lifetime, but essentially it means profiting from the office. Profiting from the office. So I think at the beginning, there's some, well, you can speak better to this, but I think in the beginning, some members of Congress were concerned about President Trump's unwillingness to divest from his business, and he clearly is profiting from several government actions, for holding events at his hotels, for example.
Sure.
And so, but I haven't heard any, there doesn't seem to be a lot of energy behind that. It's not an exciting issue.
Yeah, so there is a lawsuit that's going on with respect to
Oh,
that.
okay.
That's being brought by a couple of state attorney generals. That said, one of the House resolutions on impeachment actually has 2 articles devoted to the emoluments clause. This is one of the House resolutions that hasn't even been considered by the House. So it's out there. You can see it if you go to congress.gov, but it's got no traction. The 2 articles with respect to emoluments, one suggests that he's received foreign benefits. The other suggests that he's received domestic benefits. And so it does suggest that that would be an impeachable offense. So we talked earlier about the fact that the House Judiciary Committee in 1974 said that profiting from the office would be an impeachable offense. So if you could demonstrate that that was the case, I think that there perhaps would be a case for impeachment.
And it has to be deliberately profiting, not
Sure.
profiting by default. I mean, there's no, because of who he is as a business and him having so many hands in so many areas, there's no way that he would not profit
Right.
in any way being president of the United States. The trick would be to prove that he engaged in deliberate actions as president to increase his profits over what they already were.
Yeah.
But he's also the first president in something like 40 years that has not released his tax returns, that in essence has not created a blind trust to separate himself from the operations of where he was making his money before president. Do you think these are factors?
No, he was actually respected by his voters for not releasing his tax return. So, I mean, if the voters don't have a problem with it, why would he do anything differently?
Yeah, I think Congress needs to pass a law
Yeah.
that says you need to, or states probably, and some states are. I think if you want to run for president in our state, you need to reveal your tax returns. And I
There's
think
been some discussion on that.
it's been some discussion of that. So I think, yeah, there's no law that says you have to. So, but if we want that, we should make it a law, and so in the future we don't have this problem.
So there's actually a Republican senator from Nebraska, Ben Sass. He's actually introduced a piece of legislation on this.
He's a history PhD.
Yes. I think that if the Democrats do win the House, you're very likely to see the House actually force him to release his tax returns. I don't know if that'll cause a legal battle or not, but I do think that they do have that power to do so. It's just a question of how hard President Trump fights that. have to confess, Nixon didn't want to release his tax returns, right?
Oh, yeah, that's right, yeah.
And we turned out the reason he didn't want to release them is because he was
There's a
cheating
good
on them.
There's a good reason, yeah.
That said, even if he is profiting off the office, he's not the first president to do so. So I'm not suggesting that that makes it right. I just would say that we've actually had lots of presidents who've profited off the office. So, for example, apparently Lyndon Baines Johnson set up special telephones in the White House so that he could keep track of his investments while repeatedly telling Congress there's nothing to see here. Money tends to be a fairly powerful influencer in terms of behavior.
Well, this ends the first part of the program, which was the panel discussion and response to questions. Mark, you have one question?
One
Boy,
question.
aren't we loaded for very
Wow, I hope it's a
here,
good one.
It's just such an outstanding job.
Why don't we have two?
I have two. This one, but this one has been thoroughly discussed.
Oh, okay.
All right, okay.
Okay, well, we should have a prize for the one question, I suppose, but perhaps you'll have more. We'll ask the official question. And this is from Marty, thank you. Looked like a few more letters in there. Marty, thank you, Marty. So I should just have Marty ask the question. Can a president's conduct in a private lawsuit be used as grounds for impeachment? There's more to this, but
Can
a president's conduct in a
private lawsuit?
private lawsuit be used as grounds for impeachment? Or would there have to be evidence that clearly supports that the president is guilty of multiple acts of lying under oath, basically some sort of obstruction of justice and other offenses?
I think first it would depend on what conduct specifically. I mean, obviously the very fact that he would be engaged in a private lawsuit wouldn't qualify, but what conduct? And secondly, it's technically possible because you have that notion of impeachment that deals with the integrity of the office. So what you are doing while you are president does speak to the integrity of the office, so it's technically possible. Is it likely? I would say probably not, but it's certainly possible.
And this essentially what happened to President Clinton, right? He commits perjury. It's not a lawsuit, but it's essentially the same thing. He's in deposition. He commits perjury, too, and he was impeached, but he was not convicted. And so the precedent has been set that it would be a very high bar. It would have to be something egregious.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Clinton, one of the articles of impeachment accused him of lying in a deposition involving Paula Jones. That actually was rejected by the full House. But there were other activities that he engaged in during that process, which created an obstruction of justice article that was accepted.
Okay.
So it may not just be lying that would get you in trouble with the private lawsuit. It'd be other activities that you engaged in. So apparently, when Clinton found out so for those of you who don't know, Bill Clinton was president. He faced a private lawsuit involving the issue of sexual harassment by a woman named Paula Jones. The Supreme Court said that even though you're a current president, you're still subject to private lawsuits. In that private lawsuit, President Clinton got asked some questions about a relationship he had with an intern at the White House named Monica Lewinsky. He didn't tell, depending on how you view it, he wasn't entirely truthful, or he outright lied during that deposition. And House Republicans said that is an impeachable offense. The full House said that that specific deposition didn't warrant impeachment, but some of his actions regarding the deposition, trying to engage in some cover-up, witness coaching, and things like that, did warrant impeachment. So it would depend, I think, on the conduct. Yeah.
Because one of the things to consider, yes, lying under oath is against the law, but I think one of the things that was the topic of conversation during that time is what was he lying under oath about? And I'm not a male, but I'll just put this question, yes, I'm not. I would just put this question out there. Would male, if they are asked whether or not they cheated on their wife, would initially tell the truth? I mean, let's literally think about these things. So what Congress was essentially saying was, yes, he did lie under oath, but did it have an impact on his job functions, on his job duties? So that's why that article didn't pass. But the other means to subvert justice, that was what the issue and the problem was. I mean, he lied under oath, yes, but he lied about something that wasn't specific to his job duties, but his act of trying to stop the justice from happening, whether good or bad, right or wrong, was where the ultimate problem came in.
Excellent. Well, we've exhausted the one question. Are there any others? Go ahead.
If the president's impeached, are they held accountable by going to jail?
The question is, if the president is impeached, which would mean removed from office, you're saying, then does the president go to jail?
No. Impeachment is not a legal process, so even though one could be impeached for, let's just use perjury, it does not automatically mean it is still up to the government to press legal charges against that person, so it's not automatic.
But once the person leaves office, then they can be prosecuted. So Nixon almost certainly, I think certainly would have been prosecuted for several offenses as soon as he leaves office. When you're in the office, you're pretty much shielded from criminal prosecution. I know that's a little bit on doubt,
Well,
I think,
that's
but
kind of what's up for debate today.
yeah, but it'll be very difficult to indict a sitting president. But as soon as you leave, then you can be put in handcuffs and walked off. President Ford right away pardoned Nixon, and the very controversial decision.
Yeah.
I think in retrospect, just personally, it was a good idea to save the country that torment of going through that. But yeah, that would be the possible result. And President Clinton was disbarred.
Yes.
That was something that happened to him. So he lost his law license. He can't practice law. So.
Which I think he's fine with.
This one is not directly due to impeachment, however, it does have to do with the Supreme Court and the confirmation that is occurring as we speak. My question is this: with Kavanaugh's recent sexual assault and harassment charges being leveled against him, even though that's something that happened almost 40 years ago, how does that impact him today, before he was even a judge, anything else like that?
That's a great question. It'll be up to the Senate to determine how it impacts him. So the Constitution says that the president gets to appoint federal judges. In the case of Kavanaugh, he already is a federal judge. He's a federal appellate judge. He's being basically promoted to the Supreme Court by President Trump. The Senate, though, has to confirm that appointment. They'll need a majority in the Senate to do that, and so the Senate will make a determination on whether or not they think the allegations not only have merit, but whether they are disqualifying as well.
Interestingly, too, I think it was during the Obama administration, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid decided to remove the cloture rule from federal judges, correct? And so that meaning that before the Obama administration, that in the Senate, judges needed 60 votes, essentially, to be confirmed. And this really ensured at least some bipartisanship, in theory anyway. Well, he's shaking his head. But because they couldn't get any of President Obama's justices through, Harry Reid said, okay, for federal judges, we're going to get rid of it. And now it's a majority. If it were still 60, I mean, I would see very difficult path for Justice Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
Without the charges, I don't think he would make it.
Oh, that's a good point.
That's
That's a good point.
So
They're 51,
if there
49.
were no charges, he would not make it. But with
That's
the
true, yeah.
charges, he certainly would not.
Yeah.
And Dr. Fletcher mentioned there are definitely two layers here. One is whether or not he will advance to the Supreme Court. If the ultimate decision is that he does not advance, they still have to deal with, he's still a federal judge. Will he get to keep his position as a federal judge? Will he be impeached? These are two different levels and layers to the process. So even once next week is over with, there's still decisions that have to be made either way. Will he advance? If he doesn't advance, will he be removed from his current position due to these allegations if they are found to be credible? Both in the hands of the Senate, so.
And we have time for one more question. All the way in back.
So I'm just curious on your take as to why, with all the vetting that Kavanaugh has had in the past, why this is now an issue.
I think it's a couple of reasons. One, these things, if I'm not mistaken, the ages were juveniles, 15 and 17, if I'm not mistaken. So it is not uncommon that a lot of what happens as a juvenile is not brought into these background checks. Secondly, and again, I can only go off of what I've heard and what I've read myself, from my understanding is the person who made this allegation, it was the woman involved, Judge Kavanaugh, and one other person who was in the room, and apparently none of them, if it did happen, and this is the other thing, one person saying it happened, one person saying it didn't. This is the most extreme, there's no meeting in the middle on this, which is, oh, I think it kind of happened. That doesn't exist in this situation. The woman involved, from my understanding, she did disclose and went through some counseling, but it wasn't anything that was made public, and there was no complaint. And sometimes the FBI, they're not, foolproof. But the main reason I would say being that these things happened when they were juveniles, which has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, I'd just add, there's a story in the Washington Post that goes into the detail about it. It was over the weekend. If you want more information, I'd encourage you to read it. Basically, it says that she didn't want to come forward, but her name got outed last week, and so she felt after it had been outed that she should come forward. So that's what the story suggests.
So thank you. Appreciate for the spontaneous questions. If we could give a round of applause to our three outstanding experts. And of course, want to appreciate all of you attending today's function. I did want to point out first the support and sponsorship from our history club on campus, which is soon to become a political science and history club. There is a meeting coming up in the next 2 weeks, so if you're interested in this, if this is something that's connecting with you, we'd love you to join the family. I want to thank colleagues that came today, because Life is always a very busy time at Wade and Ben and others. And Sharon Worm, who is one of our benefactors and sponsors as well. The financial aid director has to make sure that we do this every year, and she's been a fine master to the cause. So I hope that you have a fantastic afternoon, and thank you for joining us this year.